Welcome to the Western Baul podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only, and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled, The Only Grace is Loving God. The talk was given by Mary Angelon Young on May 11, 2024, via Zoom. Angelon is a workshop leader with a background in Jungian psychology, an editor and author of As It Is, Under the Punnai Tree, The Baul Tradition, Caught in the Beloved's Petticoats, Enlightened Duality with Lee Lozowick, Krishna's Heretic Lovers, The Art of Contemplation, and other books. In this talk, she begins by speaking about the struggle with the image of God that we have and the suffering that we experience, written about by C.G. Jung in Answer to Job. She discusses the mystical revelation of her teacher, Lee Lozowick, that was evoked in reflecting on this human dilemma, and that is communicated in his book, The Only Grace is Loving God. Angelon states that Lee recognized surrender to the law, or to the will of God, as the realization of the masculine polarity of being and the destiny of all forms of existence, and that loving God, being consumed with love for the beloved, is not destiny but grace, the ultimate and distinct possibility of the human form of existence when there is awakening to the feminine polarity of being. She reminds us that we need to have our own revelation and experience, beyond concepts, and that we can consider loving God in the midst of our lives. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Mary Angelon Young.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. It is really great to see you all. I'm going to talk about how the talk's going to go, even though I have no idea how the talk's going to go, which is a good thing. I'll talk about that after the introduction, which is going to be an old song sung by Denise Lisenby. This song is 25 years ago at least that it was recorded. And the lyrics are by Lee Lozowick, who wrote the book, The Only Grace is Loving God. It will take a little bit of a dip into tonight. Let's just start. Let's get in the mood with some music. This is called Make a Little Room for Grace, performed by the Denise Allen Band.
She blows in off the mountain like a human hurricane. She opens all your windows and she laughs like she is sane. She's not all that attached, you know, to clothes or prejudice. You've got nowhere to stand no more, and you're grateful for this. Make a little room for grace. She's a woman. Make a little room for grace. Don't you love her? Make a little room for grace. But if you play her game, when she's had her way with you, you'll never, ever be the same. She'd never mention to you what she thinks that you should do. She lives you play her game, when she's had her way with you, you'll never, ever be the same. You love her, make a little room for grace. But if you play her game, when she's had her way with you, you'll never, ever be the same.
That poetry is by Lee Lozowick. I don't think Lee needs much of an introduction. I would like to dedicate the talk and the consideration tonight to him. And when I hear lyrics like that, I hear them sung or I read the poetry of the lyrics, I'm reminded so much of him and who he was. He was functioning as a guru and spiritual master, and he was so much more than that. He was a magician and a shaman and a trickster and a poet and a soul friend and a lover and many father. He was many, many, many things. He was a writer and he loved poetry. And so I find the lyrics to his songs to be so poignant and really precious, like this one. So I'm going to read the lyrics to you now in case you couldn't hear everything he was saying. Make a little room for grace. She blows in off the mountain like a human hurricane. She opens all your windows and laughs like she's truly sane. She's not all that attached to clothes or to prejudice. You got no place to stand, and you're grateful for this. Make a little room for grace. She's a woman. Make a little room for grace. Don't you love her? Make a little room for grace. But if you play her game, when she's had her way with you, you'll never, ever be the same. She would never mention what she thinks that you should do. She lives her life too freely to be caught in the net of you. She says she has no answers, that she don't need the weight. But then she seems so heavy. She's your crystal ball of fate. Make a little room for grace. She's a woman. Make a little room for grace. Don't you love her? Make a little room for grace. But if you play her game, when she's had her way with you, you'll never, ever be the same. So this talk tonight is an invitation to contemplate the phrase, the only grace is loving God, and what it might mean to us today in the world that we deal with and live in and that we're immersed in and embedded in. 40 years after Lee's original revelation in 1982, when he fell into an inspired bhav, a state of being, actually. It included the mind, but it was a state of being. It was a deeply devotional state. And it lasted for 2 weeks. And out of those 2 weeks, at the end of that time, Lee once told me, he said, all the best part happened in the first 2 weeks. And then people kept saying, Lee, you've got to write this down. And so then he started writing. And he said the best of it had already happened. But what came out of that 2 weeks of this bhav was The Only Grace is Loving God, the book. So during that time period, Lee was going into the meditation hall, and he would not sit on the teaching seat or on the dais where he sat as the teacher. He would go lean up against the wall on the side of the room and just fall into these states of being and all of this revelation that was coming forward for him. And in conversations that I had with Lee over the years about this book, because I was so taken with it, even though I didn't understand it, I really loved it. And so I'd have conversations with him and ask him questions about it. And numerous times he would start the answer with, the book was inspired by Answer to Job by C.G. Jung. So, of course, that just got me going even more. Now I was even more fascinated and even more wanting to dive into it and see what secrets it had for me. Because C.G. Jung is one of my great mentors and teachers. So we'll be hearing a little bit about Answer to Job tonight. Answer to Job, which is Jung's book that inspired Lee. Like Lee's book, it's written in this almost like ecstatic speech. Lee's book in particular is in that kind of speech, and we call that Sandhya Bhasha, twilight language. A lot of the book is a koan, and I invite you to stay with this as much as you can tonight. It's not a linear, rational understanding when you read the book. It's penetrating at some other level. So both of those books, Answer to Job and The Only Grace is Loving God, are written in this confounding, highly personal. It's very, very personal to Lee. It's very personal to Jung as he writes. And so much of it in metaphor, particularly Answer to Job. So I'm going to touch on a couple of key points that have been standing out for me as The Only Grace is Loving God has come back for me recently. And I pick it up from time to time and look at it, but I haven't actually studied it for quite a long time. And so lately it's been coming back for me and saying, yes, here I am. And here's the book. You see, it's just a really small book. It's come back for me. So there's a couple of points that I want to go into in Lee's book, but I want also give you a little bit of background so that we can have some sense maybe or some insight about what was it in Jung's work that inspired this, that it was so important to Lee that 30 years later, 25 years later, he was making sure that we understood what inspired the book. So have any of you read Answer to Job by Dr. Jung? No? So let's start there. So I see how I can weave all this together tonight for us. I'm going to talk for a while because I want to share a lot of things with you. And then at some point, we'll open up to sharing and conversation and questions and comments and all of that. So at some point in Lee's book, he says two things. He says, trust and imagination. We'll come back to this later, and I'll read the actual quote to you. He says, trust and imagination are necessary. So I'd like for you to keep a couple of words in mind as I go through this before I even start with Jung's work. 4 words, really 5. Let's say 5. Trust, imagination, wisdom, longing, and revelation. Just let them sit with you and ferment with you tonight while we're considering this. So C.G. Jung wrote Answer to Job because he needed to express and delve into his own relationship with the religion that he grew up in. Jung's father was a fundamentalist Protestant minister. And so Jung was very, very familiar with biblical stories. And Answer to Job is an answer to Job's question, why are you doing this to me, God? Why is this happening? Why is this evil going on? So I'm going to first of all give you the cliff notes of the book of Job from the Old Testament. Because this book, it's an attempt to struggle with the relationship between human and divine and the paradoxes and the fact of darkness and light in the divine, good and evil in the divine. Why do these things happen? Why is the war in Gaza still going on? Why are children dying over there? If we really allow ourselves to feel and experience fully our relationship in this realm, in this world, in this incarnation that we're in, we will come up against these questions that C.G. Jung was up against and that Lee works with in his own way in his book. So the book of Job in the Bible is a lament. As it turns out, Job is a righteous human being. He is a good human being. He is good through and through. He has done everything right. He has loved God. He has fulfilled all of the commandments. He has followed the letter and the spirit of the law 100%. He is a great, great, great devotee of his God, who in the Old Testament is called Yahweh. So we will refer to him as Yahweh from here on. And Yahweh is very pleased. Yahweh is omniscient and omnipotent, and he sees everything that's going on with Job, and he's very, very pleased. And Job's life is going well. Job has many children, daughters, sons. He has 40,000 head of cattle and 20,000 goats. Everything's going very well. Everybody's happy and content and healthy, and things are going good. So from wherever it is that the devil, also known as Satan, also known as Lucifer, the light bringer, is looking in on this situation, and he's going, I wonder if Job would be so devoted to Yahweh if his life wasn't going so well. And so he goes to Yahweh and he says, I think that your devotee, your great lover, Job, would hate you and question you and would fail to worship you, would no longer fulfill all of the conditions of worship if he's having a hard time, if his life isn't going so well. I'll make a bet with you. Yahweh says, no, I think Job would do well. I think Job will love me no matter what. And then Satan says, no, well, I will bet you. I'll wager you. And so they make a bet. They make a wager. Yahweh says, okay, sure, why not? And so what happens next is that one terrible thing after another happens to Job. All of his children die, his grandchildren die, all of his cattle dies, he loses his land, his wife. One tragedy after another occur in Job's life. And at some point, he questions God. He turns and he says, why have you done this to me? Very much like Jesus on the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? So this is the essential question that is being dealt with. Why would a loving God allow all of this to happen? And in fact, in the Old Testament, Yahweh is not necessarily a loving God. Yahweh is a wrathful God, a vengeful God, a God of omniscience and omnipotence, amoral, completely amoral, very ambivalent, very ambiguous. Anything could happen. You never know what's going to happen. And he's willing to take a bet with the devil. So all this happens. Job, he's not angry with God necessarily, but he questions him and he has doubt. And he says, why would you do this? And as the thing evolves, finally, Job realizes that he has to surrender. The only thing to do is to surrender. And he does. And he says, I will love you anyway. Basically, you are my God. You can do whatever you want to do. You are omniscient. You are omnipotent. I am your creature. You are my creator. You can do anything you want with me. That's the reality. So I surrender. And when that happens, God gives everything back to Job. Job gets new children, and a bunch of them, daughters and sons, and another 50 or 80,000 oxen and cows and chickens and goats and more land and another wife. All of this happens. But the question remains. And then, of course, it's going to come back to us again when Jesus is on the cross. So Jung goes into this. He's going to answer Job. And his answer to Job in his explorations in this book, and I'm skimming the bare surface of the book, in his explorations, one of the things that he goes through is that in the Old Testament, originally, Yahweh had the mother goddess, the Sophia, the wisdom principle. And in the process of the relationship of God and human, between the divine world and the human world, the divine image of God has to include this feminine aspect, this Sophia. This is very important because, as Jung says, when there is the marriage between Yahweh and Sophia, then the Christ consciousness can be born. And when the Christ consciousness is born, then we have a God of love, a loving, forgiving, merciful God. And this, he says, is very, very important, that as human beings, we engage and participate in our own growth and work with the image of God that we have within ourselves. We bring the feminine principle back in so that we're literally in a participation in the creation of consciousness. Jung is exploring the evolution of God in the consciousness of humanity. And so he looks at this book of Job for the metaphors and the symbols of God and the images of God that human beings have. We don't have to be of Hebrew faith. We don't have to be to the Jewish faith. If we're raised in a Judeo-Christian world, we're going to have some of this image of God in us. Whether it never shows up in a religious context, it's still in there. And we still have those questions, really, in the deep of night. So this idea of participation, back in the Old Testament, you didn't have to demonstrate any consciousness or self-reflection. And Jung even challenges God, and he says, that image of God, that Old Testament image of God, the one that did that to Job, that's doing all these things that we don't understand why they're happening, that God is both cruel and tender, conscious and unconscious, both light and dark, contains both good and evil. And so God has to be born as a merciful, loving God through our evolution, through human evolution. We find this idea in Sufism. We find it in the Bhakti tradition in Hinduism. Through our conscious participation, just as the self is born in the human person, so is this divine God of love and mercy born. This is very deep stuff. So I'm going to just say a few more things about Jung, and then we're going to go on to Lee. So Lee's reading all of this. Lee was of Jewish heritage, but he was raised in a very secular, at best, in an agnostic home, and maybe not even agnostic. He was not raised in a religious home. So Jung is saying, as we engage the process of individuation, there's 5 stages of individuation in the world of the great psychologist, C.G. Jung. The process of individuation begins with suffering. It's not really linear. It's all happening. It's a spiral and so on, but you'll see as I go through them. Starts with our suffering, dukkha, they say in the Sanskrit tradition, pain, both necessary and unnecessary. And then the next step, we're just beginning. Why am I suffering? What is this suffering for? How can this be? We begin to self-reflect. We begin to be able to see ourselves and see others. We begin to awaken a little bit. And in that awakening, we begin to integrate our own shadow. And of course, there's always gold in the shadow. It's the shadow being what we don't know about ourselves, both positive and negative. And then the next step is working with the opposites, working with pairs of opposites, good and evil, right and wrong. Yes and no, stay or go, be married or get divorced. We're always struggling between pairs of opposites, love and hate. So this work of the pairs of the opposites, the masculine and the feminine, the day and the night, the right and the wrong of it. This is an essential alchemy that we have to engage. And we're going to come back to this masculine and feminine because Lee's going to go into it in his book. And then the next stage is wisdom in the process of individuation. Wisdom, self-knowledge. Now we know a lot more about who we are. We have integrated a lot of our shadow. We're a work in progress. We have a natural feeling of ecological empathy with the rest of life. We begin to appreciate others naturally. We get along with others more. We begin to experience more compassion. for ourselves and for others. Wisdom has dawned. We understand more about how the world works. And in the last step, so to speak, or the last cycle of the individuation process, Jung calls it freedom. And he says that it's about wholeness. It's about self-realization, realizing the self, embodying the uniqueness that you are, while at the same time, you begin to realize the oneness that is existing all the time. So it is both a realization of non-duality and being at home and at peace with duality. So literally what Jung is saying in answer to Job is that as we grow, as we engage the process of individuation, then the God image, the image that we have of God within us, also grows. So just hold on to that for a bit. I'm going to move on to Lee's book, and we'll weave back in a little bit of Jung later. So Lee's book, The Only Gracious Loving God. In Lee's book, Lee says, God is impersonal. He agrees with Jung about this. God is impersonal. And God is evolutionary. And throughout the entire book, he exchanges the word God with the phrase, the great process of divine evolution. For him, it's one and the same. All created worlds, beings, things, animate and inanimate, are moving along with the great process of divine evolution. So here's a quote from Lee. All, not just human beings, but all of creation, animate and inanimate, are moved by the great process in direct relationship to the individual capacity of surrender, vulnerability, faith, and understanding, and the degree of responsibility. A quartz crystal is as responsible, he says, for awakening to the reality of what is as already present enlightenment. But a quartz crystal can do nothing about it. A human being can do something about it. A human being can do something toward that awakening. However, all, whether you're a quartz crystal or a mountain or a stream or a star or a worm, whatever you are, all are bathed, even humans. All are bathed by love without distinction in relationship to awakening. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes from Lee. These are from the book. Lee writes, "The truth of existence itself is non-dual reality. There is only God, only this great process of divine evolution. This is a given fact for all of existence, regardless of form or no form. There is no difference between a human being and a frog, a platypus, a lump of iron ore. Non-dual realization is the awakening to the truth of already present enlightenment, retroactive to the beginning of creation. This realization, this awakening, is the male aspect of the polarity of all things. It is the realization and ultimate fulfillment of the yang, or masculine nature of the being. But it is not the fulfillment of the yin, or feminine aspect, which is all form, all manifestation, all turning toward." He says, the ultimate perfection of the feminine aspect of the being is the perfection of each form as the real potential of that particular form, the unique potential of that particular form. Realizing the masculine aspect of being is the same for everyone in all forms. It's always the same. Complete existence as God and the essence of the great process of divine evolution. But the ultimate realization for the feminine aspect is different for every form. Of course, many times Lee lapses into beautiful ecstatic language throughout the book, and he'll say things like, loving God is to be eclipsed by love, blinded in radiant rapture. He says, to realize the masculine polarity is divine destiny, to fulfill the law in every moment, which eventually takes place anyway, even if it takes 1,000,000 lifetimes, because it is already true of everyone and everything. To realize the feminine polarity is human destiny, which is the playing out of the manifest, to fulfill all karmic implications in any given lifetime and to make peace with the fact of duality. So I'm going to read you some more of Lee from the book, but I want to stop here and just make sure everybody's still with me, because this is very strong and deep material. Does anybody have a question or need a clarification? Or I see a thumbs up. How's everybody else doing? Okay, good. Okay, philosophers and Sahajiya practitioners out there, tantrikas and bhaktas and everything else. So loving God is to be caressed in ecstatic joy in the play of the beloved. It is to fulfill dharma. And so this is me. Now I'm talking, okay? It is to fulfill dharma and svadharma. And Lee says, through nature or a divine momentum, and to delight in supersensory rapture. So in the Hindu tradition, there are these two words, dharma, which means the law. So throughout The Only Grace is Loving God, Lee uses the English language. He doesn't use any Sanskrit terms. But when he says law, he means dharma. He means the cosmic law, one of the most important attributes that the images of God in the Hindu tradition will show us, the Dharma wheel. Here's the law, the will of God. There's dharma in the Sanskrit tradition, in the Hindu tradition, and then there's this thing that's called svadharma, and that means the dharma that is unique to you. Sva means self. So Lee is speaking here about this feminine aspect of the being and how it needs to fulfill its destiny. It does it through fulfilling its own svadharma, because if we are fulfilling our own dharma, our svadharma, then we are aligned with dharma. We are aligned with the cosmos. We are aligned with the will of God. We are aligned with the great process of divine evolution. So he goes on to say, of course, that this only grace is loving God only happens if we have fulfilled our feminine dimension of our being. So this is a teaching from Lee. There'll be more on this. I'm going to go further into that, but just to give it a little broad perspective here, this is a teaching that will come from Lee many times in many different ways. So this is 1982. About 5 years later, he's going to write his rendering of the Thunder Perfect Mind, which is the voice of Sophia, the feminine wisdom. And he's going to give us another piece about it. He's going to give us another glimpse into something. This is a secret. It's a secret teaching. But secrets are great because secrets mean that there's going to be a revelation. And this is what Lee is interested in throughout The Only Grace is Loving God, is like, if you do this, you're going to get revelation. This is going to come for you as revelation in the depths of your own being. So loving God is not a destiny, but a gift of grace. It is the only grace. Loving God is pure gift. It is the only grace. And so await with tears, for they will flow unceasingly and in wonder when the beloved shows his form. So here are some of the things that Lee says about grace or gift. You cannot earn it. Grace is totally and freely whimsical. It is spontaneous and unpredictable. It is paradoxical, wild. It is untrue. It is illogical. It is useless and foolish. Grace is only revealed or revelatory, and it requires profound trust and profound imagination. I was mentioning The Thunder Perfect Mind, which is a recent book of Lee's that was just published by Home Press. So if you don't have that, and The Only Grace is Loving God interests you and you've read it or not, doesn't matter. You might want to get this little book. It's a quick read. The whole thing is in twilight language, but it's the voice of the Sophia, this feminine aspect, that if we follow her, if we let grace have her way with us, then we might get the only grace. We might get a little glimpse, a little taste of what it is to love God, to be eclipsed in wonder. Lee says, quote, "We exist as mortal human beings in a world in which trust is deeply necessary to the process of relationship, though it may not be necessary to the process of enlightenment. The ultimate divine possibility is always already present. The ultimate human possibility is not already present. It is given as a gift, and the gift is to love God as beloved." And as Lee once said to me personally, I was talking once about the beloved, and I kept using the masculine pronoun. Lee just quietly, he just said, "Oh, for some people, the beloved is a she. Remember, this revelation is unique to you. So what is the image of the beloved for you right now? What was it 10 years ago? Maybe you didn't even think about it 10 years ago. Maybe you did. Has it changed over time? Has your image of God changed over time? Mine certainly has, many times. I grew up in the Christian tradition, so I've had to deal with the Yahweh character off and on. He'll come back up. I want to love you. I do love you. And we're going to keep growing. There's Krishna playing the flute. There's Radha. Radha also sometimes plays Krishna's flute. There's the Divine Mother. There's Mary, the Mother of God. There's this wonderful quote from Meister Eckhart, who has lots of great things to say on this subject. He says, "What good is it to me that Mary gave birth to the Son of God 1400 years ago, and I do not give birth to the Son of God in my time and culture? We are all meant to be mothers of God. God is always needing to be born." Meister Eckhart also says, "The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love." So these are mystical statements that we're contemplating tonight. These are deeply mystical statements. I'm talking about it, and I'm trying to give some kind of a logical progression through this. And yet, as Lee says, it's spontaneous, unpredictable, paradoxical, wild, untrue, illogical, useless, and foolish. So in Lee's teaching, as the Dharma wheel kept turning for Lee, in Lee's case, he gave us the only grace is loving God, and then he gave us the thunder, perfect mind, and then he gave many teachings over about a decade of enlightened duality, which is really what this is all about. And eventually we published a book, Lee and I together, of Lee's teachings and my writings and commentaries on enlightened duality. It's really a very good book. I recommend it. He gave us enlightened duality, and then he touches on this over and over again in his poetry to Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar. And I'll come back to that. But right now I want to talk about trust for a minute. Trust and imagination are necessary, remember. Lee says, "This earth exists, like it or not, and we are dualistically designed. So the ultimate human possibility is a dualistic one, and a specifically human one. To exhibit humanness in this world with any degree of truth and ease demands trust. requires a degree of trust unheard of in any ordinary sense. So, isn't it true that as babies, we had trust? We had innocent trust. As children, maybe we trusted, but then life has this way of chipping away at our trust. We experience betrayals. Maybe we experience really profound trauma, all kinds of experiences. So, can we trust? How can we get back to trust when we've had yet another disappointment? Disappointment, one of my favorite words on the spiritual path. Some great Christian saint said, the spiritual path begins with disappointment. I just love that. I mean, how true is that? The spiritual path begins with disappointment again and again and again, not just when I was 19 or when I was 25, but today, because every disappointment is an opportunity to be present to reality. So let's keep staying with trust here. I want to read a little more of Lee. Quote, one who loves God trusts by the very nature of such a love, but the intense and studious perception of my considerations will communicate a divine revelation about trust itself. An intense and studious perception of my considerations will communicate divine revelation about the nature of trust. We must trust one another, even to the point of trusting the essential race of human beings, if we are ever to live in real community and develop any sort of educational and cultural setting in which the great process of divine evolution, or God, can be lived, communicated, ecstatically worshipped, free of the obstacles of societal prejudice, cultural biases, small-minded and exclusive thought, repression, free of argumentativeness and pettiness, and free of common egotistical reactivity. The entire consideration of loving God is so deeply associated with trust, so inherently and tacitly woven into the very texture of the consideration, that the intelligent and ardent attention to it can only be a holy benefit, a benediction. To even hint at it requires great trust and imagination. Trust leads to wisdom, and wisdom is a quality of life that one cannot be human without. So he's already told us that we have to become fully human in order to even be a candidate for loving God. Because loving God is the pinnacle of human existence, Lee says. So wisdom, we're back to Sophia and the thunder perfect mind, and Socrates, who says, wisdom begins in wonder. That's a whole other discussion on another night. One of my very favorite subjects, wonder and awe. Wisdom begins in wonder, Socrates says. So recently we published in Sahaja, which is the journal of Triveni Ashram. We're actually publishing in two parts. We've already published part one, and the second part is coming out in a couple of weeks. A transcript of a teaching from Lee. And the teaching is the only gateway to God is through the feminine. So here he is telling us again. He is not talking necessarily about woman per se or gender. He is talking about qualities of being that exist inside of every one of us. He is talking about the feminine dimension of being, the feminine process of transformation. He's already told us to awaken in the masculine is to awaken to the truth of non-duality, already present enlightenment. Everybody has it. Everybody, every stone, every grain of sand, everything, there's only God. To awaken in the feminine is to awaken to the human possibility of loving God, the only grace. So I've shared this next little piece so many times on talks, and I love sharing it. Something that Lee said to me personally at a time when I was going to him with my litany, my list of things that are going wrong, and the reason why I have recoil and reactivity and all of those kinds of things. And Lee said to me, "You are swimming in an ocean of grace. You are swimming in an ocean of grace." And although he was speaking to me personally, that was a you. That was all of us. All of life is swimming in an ocean of grace. So here's the next piece of information from Lee about this very open secret. The only gateway to God is through the feminine. The only grace is loving God through the feminine. The Bauls of Bengal say the same thing, of course. You have to enter into the condition of Radha, the consort, in order to be with Krishna. And of course, Radha realizes Krishna fully. She becomes him. She is his very self. Same with Shiva and Shakti or Parvati. Shiva's always answering Parvati and saying, because you are my very self, I will answer your question about how to do all these things. This yoga, awaken, this and that and the other thing, Kundalini and so on. So since we're swimming in an ocean of grace, if this is true, and of course it is true, we're not going to be necessarily feeling that all the time, but we might be in a position, and we are, in fact, every day in a position to have a little taste, these wild spirals that are the feminine aspect of the path of transformation. I have just a couple more things I want to talk about before I open this up. So how are we going to become transparent to grace, and especially in our times? I have been so deeply nourished by some recent teachings from Joanna Macy. I don't know if you have heard of her before. Maybe you've been to some of her workshops. Joanna Macy is 95 years old now. She's a Buddhist meditation teacher. She's a beloved teacher. She's been teaching people meditation and compassion and giving beautiful Buddhist teachings for a very, very long time. She's a scholar practitioner. And she was at the forefront of this movement of spiritual ecology. And many, many, many Buddhists have gotten deeply involved with this, and the Sufis. And of course, a dear friend, Llewellyn Von Lee, is deeply involved in spiritual ecology. And a lot of her message has been about how do we deal with the absolute heartbreak that we have of what's going on today. How do we even keep going? Some of us have adult children who are just starting out in life. My son is 52 years old, but my granddaughter is going to turn 19 soon. This is so poignant to us with children and grandchildren, what they're facing. Every time I have an opportunity to share with anybody, I talk about this because it is what's happening on planet Earth. And it is our path. It is the path. So how do we apply the only grace is loving God to this reality? So back to Joanna Macy, there's a series of what they're calling kitchen table talks that she's doing with this young woman who's 35, who is a friend and mentee of hers. But it's clear they have a very participatory and beautiful intergenerational friendship. So now at the very end of a long life of teaching, Joanna Macy, this is what she's talking about. And for me, this weaves in so beautifully with this consideration of what does it mean today that the only grace is loving God? So she says there are 3 stories in the spirit of our times today that we have to deal with. The first one is business as usual. Profit, consumerism, war, take as much as we can, greed. Oh, so what if the oceans are rising and all this stuff is going on with climate crisis? Oh, well, that was yesterday. Now it's fine today. Just let's keep going. Oh, climate change isn't real. The scientists are making that stuff up. It's not real. Business as usual. And the second story is what she calls the great unraveling. And the great unraveling is what is actually happening. The great unraveling is all the news that we get, that we've been getting for decades now, And I can think back for myself when I first realized what was happening on the planet. I was 19 years old. It was over 50 years ago, 1969, 1970. And it hit me like a lightning bolt that none of this was sustainable. I wasn't the only one that got this lightning bolt message. So this has been going on for decades. And the great unraveling, it's a tremendous heartbreak. And there have been times for me in my life when it would become so real and so immediate for me, what's actually going on, that I would just weep, sorrow, just such sorrow and sadness about it. And so Joanna Macy, of course, talks about this, that the further we get on the spiritual path, the more vulnerable and transparent we become to the divine, the more we're going to feel all of this. And we're going to feel what's happening on this planet, this beautiful planet. So the earth is being destroyed. There's ongoing horrific social injustice, genocide, war. Species are dying. It's a huge question if the human species itself is going to go extinct. It's heartbreak upon heartbreak. This is the great unraveling. That's the second story. The third story, she says, is the great turning. It's not that it's about hope. It's about promise. It's about what is still possible. It's about loving, opening our hearts and loving this planet, loving humanity, as Lee said, trusting even humanity itself. Even humanity itself, when it looks like we're just going down in flames. Trusting and loving, and still being able to see the beauty, still seeing the promise of what could happen. So there's this growing vision that a paradigm shift could happen, and really dedicating one's life to that. I'm going to do the inner work I need to do, because it really is going to happen individual by individual. Going back to C.G. Jung, he says the same thing. He says the only hope for the world is for individuals to take responsibility, for individuals to do this inner work that has to be done. Staying open in the heartbreak, staying with the possibility that there is a spiritual evolution at hand, that is what is going on, that this is part of the great process of divine evolution. This is evolutionary. And trusting in the universe, trusting in the benevolence of the universe, trusting that there is a benevolent, merciful, and graceful divine. When she's speaking about the great turning, I really love this part of her description, because for years now I've been talking about my ancestors, the Celts, and the Celtic world. One of the great teachings is stay in the in-between, go to the in-between, live in the both and, which we've been hearing over and over again tonight, working with the opposites, staying in the tension between the opposites. It's alchemical. And there's a marriage actually that happens. We could even say it's the marriage of Yahweh and Sophia, and the Christ child is going to be born from that. So in the great turning, we stay in between, and we're willing to feel the heartbreak of the great unraveling and the possible promise and the beauty of life. So, of course, it's a total mystery, and nobody knows how to do it. And every individual has to find their own particular part in the process. So I'm going to stop there and see if anybody wants to say anything, share anything, or ask a question. Right before we do that, I just want to say this one other piece. We don't know how to do this, but imagination is a key to this. And remember that Lee told us this. He said, trust and imagination. He just sticks that in the middle of a whole long thing on a roll about something. It's going to require trust and imagination.
That's a great reminder of the idea of trust and imagination being key. We need to remember that on this path that we need to be creating and being a part of creation by creating and being a party to that.
You said creativity and creation, and this idea of that we're participating with the divine, that's a place of humility. That is not an arrogant statement. But creativity, even in our daily human lives, allowing ourselves to recognize the creativity in our lives and to bring creativity to whatever we're doing, to bring beauty and enjoyment is so necessary in the midst of heartbreak. The world needs our joy. The world needs our creativity.
Did Joanna Macy say anything more about how to guide our children and grandchildren as they enter a world that appears so much more difficult than the one we had handed to us? My son and grandchild are a bit younger than yours. I have great faith that we are going to turn the corner. I don't have faith that it's going to happen even in my granddaughter's time.
Right. You can probably find all kinds of teachings by Joanna Macy. And I can say for myself with my granddaughter that I feel that the most important thing that I can do now is to just set an example. I mean, at 19, who wants to have your grandmother telling you some spiritual thing, you know what I'm saying? So here's a quote from Joanna Macy. So much in our world is overused and distorted and debased and vulgar. It invites wonder, but I choose to let myself be used for life. Maybe the great turning is simply an expression of our love and gratitude for life. It comes with heartbreak. You can't have the great turning without heartbreak. And so this thing about being an example, when I spend time with my granddaughter, I'm always looking for just little ways to be with her and to share with her what's real for me, what's true for me. When she was younger, one of the most important things for me, because this was instilled in me by my mother, was a love of nature, deep love of nature. And that as I grew, very quickly came to understand that it was the divine. I'm looking at the divine in all these forms. And that's a way of loving God. And so Joanna Macy and her young friend, they're saying we begin with gratitude, even for our heartbreak. And we live in the gap between everything that is going on in the world and our vision of what the world might be, could be, will be. It's a place of a terrible ache. We can't have one without the other. Heartbreak is part of the deal. And they're talking, of course, about change on an epic scale. It started many, many lifetimes ago, and it will continue after we're gone. It's giving life a chance for a world that does not yet exist. And the only way it can come into being is through us and passing that on to the ones to come. Even little things with our children and grandchildren, how we are present with them, being open to what they're interested in, being willing to hear them say the tough things that might be said. There's a lot of things that are true. One aspect of what is true is that there's a way in which for them, the generations that came before them failed them. So where do we take refuge in the middle of the night?
My sense of this is that loving God is something so far beyond our ordinary relationship to life. My intuition about it is that it's so rare to actually love God in the way Lee's speaking about it. You said that to awaken to the masculine is to awaken to the truth of non-duality. So I'm not sure if it's possible to understand this, but this is what mine does, and I chew on it a bit. And it seems like to awaken to the truth of non-duality is not possible unless the feminine is integrated and embodied, whether one is masculine or feminine. And the grace of loving God, I think you said this, can only occur if we have fulfilled the feminine aspect of our being. And I'm relating to this in terms of thinking, so how does one do that? How does one fulfill the masculine or feminine aspect of one's being? And when you were talking about staying open in the heartbreak, that just seems to hit it for me, to feel right for how to work with this practically. And then the thing that has really impacted me about this teaching is that my understanding is that to be a candidate, so to speak, for loving God, for grace to occur, which is completely unpredictable, is to be resting in non-duality. That would be a prerequisite to be eligible for the kind of grace that I think you're speaking about. Is what I'm saying aligned with how you look at this or different?
Well, I understand your considerations and questions, and that's not how I'm going toward it. That's not how I'm holding it. One of the things that Lee says in there is that we have to find our own way. It is an individual process. So how it exactly was for Lee may not be exactly how it is for you or for me. The teacher gives us hints and then says, now find your own revelation. Go get your own direct experience. For me, when I get into all those kinds of questions of, oh, this is too big for me, or it's too lofty, or it's beyond me, I couldn't possibly do that, I feel hopeless and totally disempowered for me. There's this thing that T.G. Jung says about religion and religious concepts, even though they may be true, that we can use them where I can't have the actual revelatory moment of realizing that that sound of the birds singing in the morning, that is a moment of me really loving God. It's real. It's true. And in the next moment, I might have an argument with my partner. Does that mean that that moment when the piercing beauty of God touched my heart wasn't real? No, I don't believe that.
I see. So you're feeling like we do all have moments of love. Okay.
Absolutely. I absolutely do. For me, that's true.
I was looking at this more as a stable state of being, of living from that place as one's relationship to life. But I'm hearing what you're saying here.
There's an insinuation of these absolutes, but Lee himself is saying enlightenment is the realization that everything is transitory, including enlightenment. So we have to find our way through this. And for me, this possibility that I work with the God image in myself, is it a merciful God? Is she merciful? Is she going to give me that little taste of the beauty of the bird song in the moment of loving God? And then I keep working with my humanity. It's a work in progress every day. And then maybe by sunset, something will relax and there'll be some vulnerability or transparency in me. And I have another little gasp of wonder. And like Lee says in the book, you have to have human wisdom. That's another little clue that he gives, because he's speaking in twilight language. And of course, he says, and I'm not a lover of God. I don't love God, he says about himself. Well, I don't think that was true. I think Lee did love God. Lee's lineage, Papa Ram Dass, Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar, lovers of God. So things aren't what they appear to be. And those are just concepts. What's your living reality? I would say that you have moments of loving God when you are with your adult children and you are adoring them. You are adoring them.
Yeah, my reference point for loving God really was Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar. And when Lee says, I do not love God, I'm hearing what you're saying, but also part of me takes that at face value. And the reality is, I don't know. And we work with these, they're concepts, but they point in a direction. And there's a mood to all this. Mm-hmm. As you're saying, like with adult children, and we all have that in our own ways.
Sure.
We have a reference point for it, I think.
You know, in the Hindu tradition, there are 5 different possible relationships with God. You can be a servant to the master. God's the master, you're the servant. You can be the child to God, the parent, God, the mother, God, the father. Or you can be the parent to God, the child, like baby Gopala, or baby Jesus, baby Ganesh. You can be friend of God. God is your friend, the beloved friend. And 5 is a lover to beloved. It's a very big, infinite, huge, immense, vast possibility. It's unlimited.
We do have to find our own way.
Mm-hmm.
I keep coming to an image, which I think is more useful for me than a concept. I'm a little inspired, or more than a little inspired, by the tarot card of the Fool, of walking into space off the cliff, not holding on to the world. For me, that image is useful for how to let go, how to appreciate, how to, and I wouldn't have had the language before, but how to work with the feminine part, my inner job, without it being about grandkids. I'm not done with me yet. So how to let go, an immediacy thing for me. I just thought I'd share that image since it's been speaking to me.
I don't expect to be done, even beyond death. I expect to be continuing. One of Lee's teachings is that there is no top end. It just keeps going, the great process of divine evolution. We're just evolving.
I hear people saying, oh, that we can pass on our wisdom to the next generations. And I feel sometimes like I have no wisdom at all to give.
Well, but you have presence.
I do have that.
Yeah, that's a big thing. You have presence and you can express your gratitude. It's that living example. And that doesn't mean that we're spouting wisdom. Wisdom, it usually doesn't communicate nearly as well in words as it does through presence. I found this to be true with my teacher, with Lee, my guru, that the most powerful experience of him was wordless, was his transmission, the transmission of his being. That was it. And Lee gave lots of teachings about mood. He was really, really interested in the invocation of mood. And that's all tied into this, the possibility. He says in The Only Grace of Loving God that we just live our lives by the suggestion. He's just suggesting, just live into the consideration. Just live into the question. Just live into that statement. Not like I've got to attain it or I have to be stable in my realization of non-duality. I would just like to close with a poem that Lee wrote to Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar, and I'm going to read parts of the poem, but not the whole poem. And he starts out with saying he's going to reveal a great secret. And James Hillman, I love this quote from him. It's from many, many years ago. And the quote is, "Secrecy is the ground of revelation." So Lee writes in the poem, Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar, our king, it seems time to reveal a great secret. Forgive me if it is too soon or if it is too much for narrow believers. Father in heaven, majestic and glorious, radiant beyond all conception, is upon us and with us, without a doubt. We rely upon that one, and without being mysterious or confusing, he relies upon us. Blasphemy, I hear the dogmatists and the preachers shout. Yes, blasphemy to you, but to him, the sweet honey of truth in the mouth of one who knows is music, a sublime song of love. As we rely on him, so he relies on us. This does not imply separation whatsoever. In fact, exactly the opposite. This means union, oneness, the perfection of the paradox of the Trinity, of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, the paradox of lover and beloved, of Radha and Krishna, the paradox of the warrior, the righteous, and the perfect servant, Sita and Ram. This ostensible paradox, only a paradox to the separative view, dissolves in the reality of, as we rely on him, so he relies on us. The fact of the uncreated, the eternally unborn, and the vision of existence, life, movement, creatures, the world as it is. This seeming dichotomy is resolved completely and finally in, as we rely on him, so he relies on us. Well, enough raving for today, Father, from your little madman Lee, who is bursting with praise for you and full of only your words. At your sacred seat I bow, I pray and adore you, dear one.